Well, this morning we are continuing our series, Jesus in Real Life, where we've been talking about the things that you and I go through in everyday life that we face, that are hard, that are difficult, that are challenging to us. And we're talking about how Jesus faced those things in his life and how he dealt with them. To actually give you and I the practical help that we need in our everyday circumstances to face those things that we find it difficult to get through. And this morning we're talking about one of those things that I think that almost all of us in this room will be able to relate with, and that is stress, anxiety, the pressure of a mounting work week, the pressure of things not kind of working out how we want them to, and we feel an amount of anxiety and pressure in our lives. We feel like it's just building, and the stress is overwhelming. I think most of us have experienced that at least a little bit in our life, where we're wishing that there were just a few less things on our plate right now. We feel like there was just a few less looming deadlines. We feel like there was just a little bit less stress in our lives. Whether it be something major like a health issue in our family, cancer, or it is something like a promotion that we were overlooked for, that we felt like we should have got, and there's just a stress that begins to build in us and causes us to feel like, when is it going to come my way? Maybe you're hoping for a particular job to open up. I don't know what it is that's kind of causing that mounting level of anxiety and stress in your life. But whatever that is, and whether it's right now or it's coming, it happens to all of us, doesn't it? Well, they say that the Holmes and Ray stress scale says that these are the top 10 stressors for adults. The death of a spouse. And some of you are thinking, I don't know. That might not be too bad. I'm just kidding. Hopefully I'm just kidding. Divorce, marital separation, imprisonment, death of a close family member, personal injury or illness, marriage, dismissal from work, marital reconciliation. Isn't that interesting? It is both the separation and the reconciliation that are one of the biggest stressors in life. Retirement. I would have thought that things like a health crisis would have been on this list. Just having counseled people over the years in many different situations. And I'm sure loss of a job, dismissal from work, I guess, is on there. But there are all kinds of things, I'm sure, that you can think of as well. This is for young adults and teenagers: the death of a parent, an unplanned pregnancy, getting married, a parent's divorce, acquiring a visible deformity, fathering a child, parent in jail for 1+ years, because if it's less than a year, that's okay, I guess. Parents being separated, the death of a sibling, change in acceptance by their peers. And so this is for kids, teenagers, and young adults. These are the things that cause them the greatest stress. Apparently it's not exams and tests, but I'm sure those are on the list for some of them. But we can all relate with being stressed and feeling anxious, fearful, or worried, can't we? I mean, there are certain things that come up in life that just cause us a level of anxiety that other things just don't. There are times and periods in our life where it feels like, wow, this is just a time where there are more things coming in. And if you're struggling with clinical anxiety or depression, I want you to know that the things that I'm talking about today are helpful, but they're not the only solution. That you can seek medical advice, and we encourage you to do that. I believe that Jesus, when he was healing with mud and saliva using commonly held medical practices of the day, was saying that it's okay to seek medical attention and to seek medical advice and to actually get help in that way if you've got clinical depression or clinical anxiety and you need to be on medication. We really encourage you to do that. I look at it as something as simple as wearing glasses. None of us goes around when we can't see properly and don't wear prescription glasses. In the same way that you wear prescription glasses, I hope that you get prescription medication to also help you to be able to function fully and completely in the way that God would want you to. So I just want to kind of put that out there, although God is going to speak to you hopefully today and some of those things, there are also medical ways to do that. But this morning we're going to look at the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, verses 35 to 41. I'm going to read that story to you, and then we're going to walk through it verse by verse. The context of this is that Jesus has been teaching about the kingdom of God to a packed house, to a full house. I know that some of you remember the story where a man actually falls out the window when Jesus is teaching in the Gospels. And this is the kind of scenario where Jesus is in a packed house, and the house is so packed that people up against one another. Clearly it's not COVID. Clearly everybody is okay with being close together. And they're a little overwhelmed by the crowds. Jesus is a little overwhelmed by the crowd. He's God in the flesh, but he's also fully human. Remember that. And he wants to get away with his closest friends for a bit of recharge. And I love how in the in-between parts of the story, Jesus is actually teaching us. Jesus is actually teaching us when it says that he needed to get away for a recharge. That the God who created heaven and earth in human form, in a human flesh, actually realized that his body doesn't just go forever. And he actually needed to get away for a rest and recharge. So let's look at the story together. Mark 4, starting at verse 35. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There was also other boats with him. And a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. How many of you have been out on the water before, and the water starts rushing into the boat? Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said, "Teacher, don't you care if we're going to drown?" And he got up, and he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." And then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." So let's break this down this morning. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." Now Jesus is referring to the Sea of Galilee, and he's wanting to take them to the other side. Now the disciples are going to be uneasy about this because they like sticking closer to Capernaum in their boats where they're used to fishing. And the Sea of Galilee isn't a small sea. This is going to have giant waves. In fact, the Sea of Galilee is known to have monster waves that can come up and crash over the boat as we see. And the disciples are actually feeling anxiety about this, I would imagine, as there is a discomfort with this. It's unfamiliar territory for them. How many of you have anxiety in unfamiliar territory? In uncharted territory? In places that you haven't been before, where you're kind of going, I'm not sure, God, is this the step I'm supposed to take? Is this where I'm supposed to go? I'm going into an uncertain place, a risky place, a place of uncertainty, a place where I'm not comfortable. I think most of us have a certain anxiety, a certain hesitation in going into something new that we aren't comfortable with. And their worst fears are actually realized. So this isn't good news, is it? They step out, they get out onto the waters, and a furious squall comes up. I'm sure all of you know what a squall is. It's a giant storm. comes up. And the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Now I think this is one of those things in Scripture, again, that we just kind of go, oh, there was some nice little gentle waves that crashed up onto the boat, and there was an inch of water. No, the boat almost sunk. They were swamped. There's several feet of water that have actually come into the boat, and they're trying to figure out, we can't build this thing fast enough. We can't get out of this. Which raises this question to all of us. Does God cause this in our life? I mean, they've stepped out in faith. They've kind of done what Jesus told them to do, and now this terrible thing is happening. And I think sometimes in our life, when we step out and we kind of go, hey, this was God's plan for my life. This is what I was thinking He wanted for me. And I'm stepping out and doing the very thing He's asked me to do, and it's not all working out the way I wanted it to. It's not comfortable. It's not easy. In fact, this is way harder than I thought it was. And I got hit by a squall. My worst fears of what bad could happen happened. So how could this possibly be God's will? I mean, bad things can't happen to good people like me. Does God cause storms in our life is really the question we're asking. God, why would you allow this to happen? Does God cause them? The answer is complicated. Some theologians say yes. Some theologians say no. I say yes and no. That makes it easier, doesn't it? It's actually complicated. It's not a simple answer. Because God allows storms to occur in our life. And there are certain times where God actually allows things to happen in such a way that they're for our good. We need to remember that Jesus took the punishment for our sin, yet God does discipline His children. Hebrews 12 says there's natural and spiritual consequences for sin in our lives. Sometimes God does cause those things to happen to get us to repent, to get us to actually come back in line with His will and His desires. Did God cause that? Well, no, our sin caused that. And the reality is, if you spend all the money in your bank account, guess what? There's no money left in your bank account. And that's not God's fault. That's your fault for spending all the money in your bank account. So the reality is there are natural consequences to certain sins in our life. Just like blood pressure going up when I eat too much. That's a natural consequence in my body to sin. See, there are natural and spiritual consequences that God disciplines with us. He corrects us with. He says, this isn't actually good for you. This isn't how I designed you. This wasn't what was best for you. And so, number two, sometimes God allows trials for our greater good. So this isn't God causing it, but God allowing it. Romans 8:28 says, for all things work together for good for those that love God and are called according to His purposes. All things God will use for your good and turn them out for good, but they might not begin as good. Because you and I see good as comfortable, as immediate, as what makes me feel good. And so our assumption is that if it's good for me, it's because I'm comfortable and it's easy. Genesis 50:20 says that what the devil has planned for bad, God will use for good. And so there's also an enemy in your life that's working against you that actually wants to bring things that sometimes, as we saw in the book of Job, that God allows the enemy of God to actually bring things into our life that God will turn around and use for good in our life. Things that God doesn't desire for us, but has allowed. See, good is a tricky word for us to get our heads around. We tend to think it means convenient, comfortable, and immediate. We tend to think, well, it's what I want, when I want it, how I want it. We tend to think that it's about us. We tend to think, boy, God, why would you allow this storm, this squall, this whatever it is that you're going through in your life? Now, I've got an illustration for you this morning. Imagine that I am an environmentalist, hugging trees, licking frogs, eating bugs. And I'm walking through the woods with my backpack, and I'm enjoying myself, hugging those trees, licking those frogs, and eating those grasshoppers, when I see a bear trapped in a clam. Now I have a choice to make. I can run away because he's a ferocious bear and he scares me, or I can decide to help the bear. Only, who wants to get close to a bear in a trap? Because the bear doesn't know that what I want to do is good. He doesn't know that I want to release him from the trap. He thinks, no, this terrible person wants to harm me, and I'm in pain. So the bear's going to lash out at me. So what do? I shoot him full of tranquilizers, and I get close, and I actually have to hurt him more. I actually have to push the clamps further onto his foot in order to release the clamp and let it go so that the bear can be free. Now the bear doesn't look at me and go, oh, nice person, thank you so much for freeing me from this trap. He's thinking, no, this terrible person has hurt me more. I want to get him. And it's like that with us in our relationship with God. God sees the bigger picture. He understands what's going on, and sometimes in our life we're caught in a trap, and God is trying to get us out of that trap, and we think it's bad. And God's like, see the bigger picture. I've got all of eternity in mind. God is all-knowing, all-powerful, and ever-present. He knows the beginning and the end of your story, and He knows what is ultimately best for you. Even though what you're going through right now, or what you went through last year, or the year before, or going to go through in 2 months from now, isn't what you wanted. See, God sees the bigger picture, and so He allows things to happen that may be unpleasant, but can still be seen as good from a greater perspective in our life. Number 3, other people's sin causes stress for us. Hoarding of resources or gossip about us. But God allows free will to exist for love to exist. Love cannot exist if we were all robots and couldn't make choices for ourselves. And so God has to allow choices. Because many of us go, look, there's enough resources on this planet that everybody could be fed. But the reality is, it doesn't work out that way. Because some are hoarding resources in a way that doesn't allow everyone to actually get the resources that they need. So God's provided it, but systemic sin, so we're not even talking about necessarily individual sin, but we're talking about massive systemic global sin of hoarding of resources in certain areas isn't allowing for the provision for those globally that need it. I mean, we still don't even have clean drinking water on our national reserves in Canada. We have third world conditions. And that's ultimately because of sin. But we have to allow that in order for us to be able to choose a relationship with God and be in a love relationship with Him. The causes of stress are also a result of our fall. If God abolished all sin, you and I wouldn't exist. Now this is one we don't like to admit, but Romans 3:23 says, for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That every single one of us isn't quite as perfect as we like to think of ourselves as. Because we judge ourselves based on our intentions, as we talked about last week, rather than the truth about our own sin. And so good is one of those relative words, isn't it? Because we have all fallen. If God abolished all evil, all sin, guess what? We no longer exist ourselves. And number 5, the devil causes much of our stress. We're in a spiritual battle each and every day of our lives. Ephesians 6 says to put on the full armor of God, to put on the breastplate of righteousness, the belt of truth, the sword of the Spirit, the footpiece of the readiness of the gospel, and the helmet of salvation. To arm ourselves for a spiritual battle that we're in. Because the enemy of God wants to come to steal, kill, and destroy. John 10:10 says that Jesus came that we might have life, and life more abundantly. But the devil comes to steal, kill, and destroy. So how we respond to stress matters more than who or what is causing it. James 1, 2, and 3 say, consider pure joy, my brothers and sisters, when you're facing trials of many kinds. When you're facing the squalls, when you're facing the storms of life. Because the testing of your faith develops perseverance, and perseverance, true character. God's actually building something in you. He's more interested in your character than your comfort. He's more interested in your future than your immediate. Look at how Jesus is responding to this squall, though, in the midst of it. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. Ever feel like, God, are you sleeping during the squall of my life? The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drown? God, don't you care about me in the midst of this? God, don't you care that this happened to me? This isn't fair. This isn't right. This is unjust. This is not what I wanted. This is not what I think is best. We ask that question, does God care? The disciples asked the question, Jesus, don't you care? They didn't ask Jesus to calm the storm. They wanted to know if he cared. They didn't ask Jesus to pray to God like the sailor in Jonah 1 who approached the sleeping prophet for help. They just wanted to know if Jesus cared. Why are you letting this happen to us? You told us to come out here. This is your fault. Or maybe they just wanted him to help row back to Capernaum. Hey, don't you care? Get an oar. That would have been some of your responses. Jesus, get an oar. In the same way, we don't turn to God in those moments. We're too busy wondering if God cares about us. We're too busy wondering why this is happening to us. We're not sure of who God is, that he really has the power to intercede on our behalf. We're so consumed by the problem and so busy trying to fix the situation ourselves that we forget to turn to him. Until after we've tried and tried and tried, and we give up and we go, okay, God, I need your help. But I want to say this to you. Don't focus on why the problem exists. Focus on who can solve it. Don't focus on why the problem exists. Focus on who can solve it. Invite him in. Invite him into the midst of what you're facing. Jesus got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. See, Jewish people believed that God controlled the wind and the waves. Psalm 107:29, Jonah 1:5, and Jesus is powerful enough to overcome the situation that you're into, whatever that is. See, the cross is Jesus' way of declaring victory over tragedy again and again in your life. From the cross, Jesus declares that he's got that one covered too, that he's taking it on the cross for you and I. Imagine the scenario where you're the devil. You've probably never done that before. I'm glad. But imagine with me, just for a moment, even though you don't want to, that you're the devil. And you're thinking to yourself, God has this way of loving human beings, and you want to destroy them. And God creates these human beings, and he lovingly cares for them in the garden, and you're constantly trying to create schemes and ideas to take them away as hostages and to damage them and to hurt them and to do things to them. And so God sends prophets to enlighten them. And so you kill the prophets because you're the devil, and you go, no, I want them to be on my side, not on his. And so you began to plot out, and then you see it. God does the most ridiculous thing of all. He sends his own son. And you think, now I got him. All I have to do is inspire some of my agents, Herod, Pilate, and the Roman soldiers, and get him crucified. And that's exactly what you do. And in the moment where you as the devil are thinking, I finally got victory, and you've nailed Jesus to the cross, and you're dancing, it's my birthday, it's my birthday, because God's own son is dying, and you discover that you just lost the greatest victory of all time. See, the death of an evil person, the murder of an evil person, is not good. The death of a good person is obviously evil. But the death of a perfect individual who has never done wrong, that's the greatest evil there is. And in that moment, God brings victory over the greatest tragedy of all time. And it isn't a one-time thing. It's actually the way that God works in the midst of tragedy in your life, in the midst of it. On the cross, Jesus is saying again and again, this is why I died. I died to bring victory out of tragedy in your life over and over again. I came to make the powerless powerful. I came to make those who were ashamed feel honored. I came to those who were struggling in their sin to find themselves released from captivity. I came to show you that in the midst of whatever you're going through, I'm screaming with you from the cross and declaring your victory is to come. It's just not yet. We're still left with this question. Why not just eliminate it all? Why not just get rid of it all? But a good parent disciplines their kids because we know what happens if they don't. God knows it will ultimately be for our good. God can't abolish all evil without destroying us too. He cannot destroy free will and allow for love relationships. And the devil has earthly reign until Jesus returns. But know this, the justice delayed is not justice denied. And so Jesus said to his disciples, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. I mean, imagine the scenario. You think you're about to drown. You're swimming in water on your own boat. You're swamped. You're splashing around from side to side in the boat thinking, what are we going to do? And it all dissipates in an instant when Jesus speaks. Jesus sleeping was actually a declaration of who he was. It was an indication of faith. That tranquility in a storm was an indication of faith. And you and I have access to that through the Spirit of God, not in our own strength and in our own ability, but the peace that surpasses understanding comes as we invite in more and more of the Spirit of God to actually bring calm in the midst of the storm. Being tranquil in the midst of life's stress and storms requires a complete trust and reliance on Jesus. Regardless of the circumstances, regardless of what we see. Experiencing stress itself is not sin. You need to understand that. Think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was so stressed out that he actually sweat blood, which we know is a medical condition that actually is caused by extreme anxiety. And so Jesus fully understands whatever you're going through. If you've never been stressed out so much that you sweat blood, he's got you. He's experienced that kind of anxiety. And he took it to the cross. He's released you from it. They were in uncharted territory where they had no control. And something bad happened. It's not like they were on uncharted territory and it was fear, false evidence appearing real. No, they were right. They should have been worried. The worst thing that possibly could have happened. But instead of turning to him, they just wanted to know why he didn't care. They weren't sure if it was God's fault. Did he really want what was best for them? They were questioning his character. Did he care about them? Why was this happening? They were focused on why and what was causing that, not who could solve it. They didn't know who Jesus really was, that he loved them. And that's how often you and I respond. Why? What? Instead of, oh God, meet me in the midst of this. We trust in ourselves. We're so consumed with determining why something is happening. We're consumed with trying to solve the problem. We lack the ability to trust in those moments. Does he care? The cross proves that he does. Is he good? He wants what's best for you eternally, not just in this moment. And his grace is always forgiving us in mistakes. Seeing life from God's perspective requires faith, a complete trust and reliance on Jesus and the person that he is, regardless of circumstances. He wants to enter into what you're facing right now. He wants to enter in and be present with you from the cross, bringing victory over tragedy again and again and again. Jesus trusted in God despite the stress he faced in life. The question is, will you and I?